Well, good morning from Cottage Farmstead. If we haven't met before, I'm Rebecca. As you can see, I have a bag of green beans that I need to start processing and getting into our freezer. And I figured while I do so, I could chat a little bit about food preservation and what that looks like here on our homestead. So a lot of times when people are starting to get into homesteading and vegetable gardening, they have this goal in mind of wanting to grow 100% of their food or a year's supply of food from their land, which is a noble aspiration to have. But just going to the seed store and buying a whole bunch of packets of seed that sound good and then throwing them out into your garden is not going to necessarily cut it. So it's really tempting when you're going through seed catalogs to find all these cool, neat varieties in there. And there are a few things to keep in mind when you are looking through the seed catalogs before you even get your garden started, if you are wanting to grow enough to feed your family for a year. One of the main things before you even buy the seeds is to figure out what actually grows well in your area. Here in the southeast, we are plenty toasty and hot, and we can grow a lot of the heat-loving crops. But a lot of other homesteaders that live in the northeast are able to grow onions over the summer. We can't grow onions to save our life over the summer, but they grow fantastic over the winter. So it's one of those things you have to plan your garden out a little bit more if you're wanting to grow certain crops and a year's supply worth of them, rather than just throwing a whole bunch of seeds in the ground outside and hoping that they grow. Another important thing to consider is, do you actually like eating some of these vegetables? Radishes grow pretty great and easy for just about anybody, but do you actually want to eat 50 pounds of radishes, and how are you going to preserve all of those radishes? Do you have enough refrigerator space? Do you have a root cellar? Do you like them pickled? So there's different things that you need to take into consideration before you start growing a whole bunch of food and you have armloads and bagfuls of produce coming in, so that you're not overwhelmed and get burned out on your first year trying to grow a year's worth of food. But other than those preliminary, more like garden planning questions, as far as food preservation goes, there are two main things that need to be considered when you are making your food preservation plan, especially if you're wanting to grow a full year's worth of food. So the first is, how much do you actually need to preserve? Because that will determine how much you need to plant in your garden. And you also need to consider how you want to preserve the produce. And that does sometimes go back to personal preference. For example, I don't like canned green beans, so I freeze all of my green beans. But knowing ahead of time how you're planning on preserving all of these crops will help you space them out a little bit better so that you're not overwhelmed by all of the harvest coming in at one time. You're able to plan out your preservation work. So while it would be really convenient if I could tell you right now exactly how much you needed to grow per person for your family, every family is unique, every person is unique, and despite different charts and things that you may find on blogs online, those are just general guidelines based off of what that particular person that wrote that blog post does for their own family. So for example, with the green beans that you see me working on here, I know that Farmer Nathan and I will eat probably about a quart bag of this as steamed green beans every month throughout the calendar year. So I will be taking this as a side dish, dumping it into a steam basket on the stove, and we'll be eating it as a side dish. But that's not the only time Farmer Nathan and I eat green beans. I also have a couple different soup recipes that we enjoy during the winter months that call for green beans. So I also need to consider, how often do I tend to make those soup recipes, and to make sure that I put enough bags away in order to make those soups as well. So you can see it does really come down to the preferences of your family and how often you eat particular food items. So there are a few helpful resources out there for determining how much you need to grow of something for a year. For a place to get started, if you want to dip your toes into that this year, we have a e-workbook on our website that you can download. So there's several different worksheets in that ebook that will help you walk through the process of determining how much you need of a particular crop based on the recipes that your family already loves to eat. So I think the example in the ebook is like spaghetti sauce. So how often does your family eat spaghetti? And so figuring that out and having some workspace to calculate, okay, this is how much tomato sauce we need, this is how much tomato sauce you can get from a pound of tomatoes, and then there's some helpful charts to help determine, okay, if I need this many pounds of tomatoes, this is how many tomato plants I need to be planting just for my spaghetti sauce needs. So it's very helpful if you're wanting to start figuring out generally how many plants that you need to be planting in your garden. Another great resource if you're wanting to go a little bit deeper into preserving your food for a year is the Family Garden Plan by Melissa K. Norris, and I'll link this below as well. She has even more charts in here for calculating how much food you need to grow based on how many pounds you need and how many plants you need, so that's another great resource. And if you really want to get into the thick of it and want to like maximize how much you can grow on each plant, especially if you're working in a small space, there is another book called High Yield Vegetable Gardening that goes into greater detail on how to maximize for just about every crop under the sun, and I'll also link to that down below. So for the last few years, I haven't had a specific food preservation plan that I was working from. It was mostly up in here, but mostly that was because I didn't have that much growing space to work with. When we were building our farmhouse, we had a little 20 by 20 plot, and I was trying to put tomatoes and cucumbers and green beans in there to grow, but I didn't have enough space to necessarily grow a year's supply, so I wasn't super concerned about like over preserving food that we were going to eat because we just weren't growing that much as we were busy with our house build. Last year we had more growing space, and I put a little bit more thought into it, planned out at least the tomatoes and peppers pretty accurately. But I overgrew things like green beans and pickles and preserved too many of them, and we are still eating them out of the freezer right now. And we are starting to get them coming out of the garden simultaneously. So I know that I over-preserved certain things. So this year I wanted to be crystal clear on when I can stop preserving certain items, as I am in my 3rd trimester of pregnancy and I only have so much energy to go around, so I don't want to put too much time and effort into something that we are not actually going to eat or going to be giving away, or potentially could go to waste if it gets tossed in the back of the freezer for a couple of years. So I sat down when we were in the honeymoon phase of the garden, when things are growing but I'm not pulling a harvest out of the garden just yet, and planned out what we actually needed to grow. I took a look in our freezer to see what we had a lot of excess of. I looked in all of our canning jars to see how much I preserved last year. Do I have too much of a certain item? To know what my cutoff point is with certain crops. So it turns out we had a ton of tomato sauce. I preserved several batches of tomato sauce last year, in addition to having preserved a ton of tomato sauce in 2021 before we started building our house. So I had an entire shelf of tomato sauce that I knew we were not going to be able to eat through fast enough, especially since we're hitting the 3-year mark on canned goods. And they don't recommend eating canned goods that are older than 2 years, typically. So we started passing that around so we can use it up a little bit more quickly. But I know this year that I don't need to can like 40 jars of tomato sauce, that 20 jars is probably going to be sufficient, and I can stop canning tomatoes at that point and use my limited energy that I have this summer on other food preservation activities. So after I looked through our freezers and our canning shelves downstairs, I came back upstairs and made a list of everything that we wanted to can this year and what we wanted to freeze this coming year, along with taking note of how much I wanted to preserve of each item to know when it's time to stop preserving certain things so I don't overfill our freezer and overfill our shelves when space is definitely at a premium. So like I mentioned earlier, we had a lot of tomato sauce left over, and I still have probably about a dozen jars from last year. So I'm only planning on doing 1 batch of plain tomato sauce this year. But we have so many tomatoes that are just about to ripen on the vine right now, so I need to find a way to incorporate that into my preservation plan when I don't need that much tomato sauce. One thing Farmer Nathan and I learned is that we actually consume the tomato sauce mostly as pizza sauce rather than as plain old tomato sauce. So I'm only going to be canning the tomato sauce for different soup recipes that call for plain tomato sauce. But I am going to plan on canning marinara pizza sauce this year Since we have started having weekly pizza nights, that's how we were eating most of our canned tomatoes last year. So I'm going to be doing 2 batches of the pizza sauce so that I have enough pizza sauce to last us for the calendar year. Last year we discovered that we enjoyed tomato jam as kind of a barbecue ketchup cross. I had a couple jars left over from last year, so I know I canned a little bit too much, but I want a few more jars of it on hand for the coming year. If I do end up with a few extra of these that seal for me nicely, they may end up becoming gifts as well. So that's more of a bonus of the tomatoes if I continue having them come in. Last year I started canning our diced tomatoes rather than freezing them. And I found that so much more convenient when I was cooking than the frozen ones. So I'm planning on doing mostly canned diced tomatoes this year. So I will be doing batches of quarts and pint jars since different recipes call for 28 ounce or 15 ounce jars. So I'll be doing 2 batches of each of those, and that will last us for the year. And the one experiment that is just for fun is tomato juice or a Bloody Mary mix. There is a particular vegetable soup recipe that Farmer Nathan and I love to have, and it calls for Bloody Mary juice mix. And I found when browsing some of my canning recipe books that they had a Bloody Mary mix. So I thought it would be neat to can enough to make maybe 2 or 3 batches of that soup with the homemade Bloody Mary mix. One thing I don't have on here with tomatoes is salsa. I canned a lot of red salsa last year, and we still probably have about 20 jars of salsa. So since I already have so many jars of red salsa down in the basement, I'm not gonna waste any time on doing that this year, and instead focus on experimenting a little bit with this Bloody Mary mix and making more of the marinara sauce that I know that we're gonna eat. Next up is our cucumbers or pickles. So as far as I'm concerned, I only like eating cucumbers fresh. I don't like them pickled. So the pickles are only for Farmer Nathan. And in years past, we've had so many cucumbers coming in that I'm trying to keep up with the harvest, but not taking into consideration that since I don't eat the pickles, we don't need that many jars of pickles for one person to be the only one eating them. So this year I made a note that I only need to do 1 batch each of the dill pickles and the bread and butter pickles. We gave some of the bread and butter pickles away as gifts. We've been pulling them out at every cookout gathering we've had this summer, trying to use up the ones from last year. But now I know going into the future, 1 batch of each is sufficient to keep Farmer Nathan happy for the year ahead. Last year I did experiment with a few different canning recipes that we ended up really liking. So I made cowboy candy or candied jalapenos, and Farmer Nathan and my family have really enjoyed eating those. They're nice if you're doing like chips and crackers on a charcuterie board or putting them on top of your tacos. They've been a really great addition. And then one of Nathan's sisters was making a chow recipe that Nathan really liked on burgers and hot dogs and toppings on a couple other different dishes. So they gave us a couple jars and Farmer Nathan ate through all of them very quickly. So I got the recipe and I'm going to be incorporating that into our canning routine this year, since I know at least Farmer Nathan is going to be eating at least 1 batch worth of the chow. The last few years our tomatillo plants have not done well, so I am totally out of homemade salsa verde. So I'm hoping to at least do 2 batches of it this year, but we'll have to wait and see if our tomatillo crop does well. But if it does, I know that we probably go through about a jar and a half a month of green salsa based on what I've been buying over the past year. So that is the amount that I'm aiming for to can. And then up at the top here, I've already finished this task because our berries came in early and in an abundance this year. I only canned probably about 5 or 6 jars of jelly last year, and that was definitely not enough. We didn't have a very good berry harvest last year as our plants were still young. The wild blackberries around here didn't do great. They had a late freeze and most of them didn't produce any fruit. But this year we've had plenty of fruit coming in. So I've done several batches of berry jams, so that'll last us throughout the year. So even though we have a lot more berries coming in right now, I know that I don't need to be canning any more jam as we have plenty of it downstairs, so we can enjoy eating them fresh. We can give them away to friends and family, or we can sell them around here locally. And that is it as far as my canning goals for this coming year. I do have a note down here that if I have time and energy, it would be interesting to learn how to make my own tomato paste, to just add another skill to my tool belt. But that is not something that is necessary. But since we have so many tomatoes out on the vine, I figured if I'm overflowing with them, have a little bit of time and energy, it would be an interesting experiment. And I already have a recipe marked out to give it a try if I want to get to it. So at the bottom of this page here, I have my freezer goals. As you saw in a previous video, I like to chop and freeze our onions for the year. And so I've already put up the 15 bags of chopped onions that I know that we'll need for the year ahead. So those are already down in the freezer. I still have onions left over. I know a few of them will be going into things like our bread and butter pickles and like my tomato sauces and things like that. So I'm keeping some of them aside. But knowing precisely how many bags of onions I needed in the freezer allow me to know when I should stop chopping all of those onions and move on to other food preservation tasks. Similarly, kale came in the late spring, and I was putting that up in bags in our freezer as well, and I got up to the amount that I know that we'll need for quiches and soups throughout the year. So I know that I am done on the kale. Still have some kale coming in, a lot of it starting to bolt at this point in the summer. But the little bit of kale that I have coming in, I know that we can be cooking with and making kale chips or doing something else with in the kitchen rather than trying to preserve it. Like I mentioned, we have a lot of berries coming in that I did can the amount of jam that we wanted, but we do like having frozen fresh berries that we can put in muffins and smoothies and berry crisps and that sort of thing. So I have a note here that I want about a quart bag per month in order to make some of those various things. We don't eat blueberry muffins every week, so I don't need a ton of bags of them, but just having a variety of berries on hand in the freezer to pull from throughout the year. So I'm aiming for about 12 to 15 of those. Then next up, I have my bell peppers. I like to dice them and put them in our freezer like I do our onions. But when I was looking at our freezer inventory, we had a lot of diced bell peppers left over from last year. So I know that I over preserved it last year, and I have plenty of backlog, so I'm only planning on doing about 12 quart bags worth of it this year, as that will work in most of the recipes that we cook with bell peppers in throughout the year. Then with green beans, last year I preserved pretty much the exact amount of green beans that we needed, but this year I'm planning on preserving a little bit more, as I know this time next year I'm going to have a baby that's going to start experimenting with eating foods, and green beans a good food to have on hand for that, for them to start tasting different vegetables. So I'm planning on preserving a couple more bags of green beans for baby in addition to Nathan and I. And looking through the freezer, we had a ton of okra slivers left over. We really enjoyed eating oven roasted okra last summer. We made it every other week pretty much, and it was so good. But we discovered that frozen okra slivers do not turn out nice and crispy when you put them in the oven. They turn out to be kind of mushy and gross, and so a lot of those are going to end up being food waste for our compost pile. But we did use the okra slices in things like gumbo, so I'm going to preserve a handful of bags for a couple gumbo recipes throughout the fall and winter. Then with carrots, we preserved pretty much the amount of carrots that we needed, and we're going to be harvesting more carrots again in about a month or two. And similar with the green beans, I am planning on preserving more carrots this year than I did last year to incorporate into baby food. And then zucchini, about 2 or 3 years ago, I shredded a whole bunch of zucchini, and I'm still eating off of probably like 2020 zucchini for zucchini bread. I'm down to my last bag, so I know I'm going to need some more, but I know I do not need to freeze quite as much as I did in 2020 when we had so many zucchini coming in. So I'm only going to do about 4 to 6 bags of pre-measured out zucchini for zucchini bread, as we don't make it but maybe a couple times a year. And that's it for my canning and freezing goals for this coming year. We do have quite a few crops that are growing out in the garden that don't require a whole lot of labor to put up for the year ahead. And we did that on purpose, as we knew my energy and time would be diminishing as my third trimester continues. So we planted things like potatoes, sweet potatoes, winter squash, popcorn, things that after you harvest them, let them cure or dry completely, you can just stick into the basement and they take care of themselves for several months, and there's no labor in the kitchen involved. So we figured that would allow us to be able to maximize how much food we're able to put up for the year with minimizing the amount of labor input that goes into preparing it for long-term food storage. I hope you found this video helpful and give you a few things to consider as you're planning your food preservation this gardening season, and that seeing how we plant our garden was helpful for you. If you have any other topics that you would like us to cover in a future video, feel free to comment down below. And with that, I'll keep snapping my green beans here, only 20 bags worth of them, and I'll catch you next time.